Beautiful. Good. All right. We've got a good connection. Thanks so much for joining me, Jasmin. So I'm here today with Jasmin, who is a friend of mine and also a fellow Jivamukti yoga teacher. So we're going to talk a little bit about that lineage as well. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yay. So Jasmin's had a baby in the last year. How old is he?
Just turned 1.
Yeah, right. So she's in the throes of new motherhood, and we've had a little bit of a juggle to find the opportunity to connect, but we're here, which is great. And part of the reason that we're doing a pre-record rather than a live is because Jasmin is due to be going up, I think, into the Northern Territory. Is that right?
Northwest Queensland.
Northwest Queensland, and spending some time on country, which is very interesting and exciting. So can you tell us a little bit about that? What are you up to?
Sure. So I've recently gotten some money through a project to create a dance work based on my my heritage, I guess, and the notion of preparing ground, which actually kind of feeds in really well to our talk today. So yeah, I'll be heading to Croydon in the Gulf of Carpentaria to spend a little bit of time and reacquaint myself with relations there. I didn't grow up there, so it'll be a beautiful time of reconnecting and immersing myself on country.
Yeah, amazing. I remember actually in one of our previous conversations you telling me that you feel like you've had more education and more sort of lineage connection with some elders that aren't part of your actual kind of ancestral lineage. Have I got that right? Because you've lived and what you've been exposed to.
That's right. So I grew up in Victoria on the Mornington Peninsula and lived in Sydney for the last 16 years. So I've definitely growing up and moving to Sydney and being a part of the community here, I've been more nurtured, I guess, and a part of the Bunwarang and Wurundjeri communities down in Melbourne, and the Gadigal and Dharawal Wongal communities here in Sydney.
And do you know anything about what might be some of the sort of differences between those communities and the community that you're going to explore that's part of your heritage and your lineage? Like, are there any obvious differences?
So Croydon, where my nana is from, is really remote and it's a very small town. So like that in itself is going to be hugely different. I grew up in the city, and so there's one town, Normanton, which is probably about an hour's drive away, which has like one street.
Wow.
Which has a pub and like a food works and petrol station, what have you, library, town hall, etc. But Croydon has very little. So that's a major difference. I don't know, I guess. I've been there once before, but this will be the first time since my nana's passed away, and I will also be going with my dad. So
beautiful.
Yeah, it's going to be a beautiful time.
And I mean, I actually think for all of us as human beings, there's something very powerful about discovering our ancestral lineage. Like, I know a lot of people are very interested in family trees these days and sort of like understanding a bit about our heritage and the stories of our grandparents and our parents. And for example, one of the things I've become really interested in as a doula when I'm working with women in childbirth is talking to women about what they know of how their grandparents birthed, like how their grandmother's birthing experience was, and just this sort of idea of how birth evolves through generations, and that there will be common threads, but there will also be huge differences as well. And I just wonder, for you as an Aboriginal woman, like as part of Indigenous community, what does it feel more important to explore your ancestry and to sort of go through that experience of heritage? Is that more important for you now as a mother, or how are you feeling into that?
Yeah, I've definitely, having my baby has made it feel even more important to connect back to my Nana's community, just so that I have something more concrete to pass on to him, and that I can make those really strong relationships, so that when he gets older and he's wanting to return to country, that those relationships are already established, that he doesn't have to retry and start afresh. Because my Nana left her community when she was in her late teens. So she did go back and forth, but over the years, people pass away, and other people move away as well. And so those things slowly start to become more distant. So I'm hoping that that's what I can pass on to him.
That's beautiful. And then I guess also sort of reflect the culture and your learnings in a broader way through dance, right? Through the performance element as well.
That's right. Yes. But also in my daily life, I think having some more cultural wisdom from my own area, I think will just make me feel a little bit more steadfast within myself, and I can pass that on to my son too.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So I had something quite specific. We've actually discussed what we want to sort of talk about today, and we're both Jivamukti yoga teachers, and I know that people listening will know a little bit about Jivamukti because it's something I've mentioned in some of the other talks. But for those who perhaps haven't listened to those other talks, Jivamukti is a lineage founded by our teachers Sharon Gannon and David Life in New York City in the 1980s, and amongst other things, Jivamukti heavily emphasizes a relationship to and reflection on Shastra scriptures, Sanskrit scripture. So kind of keeping our lineage or connection to yoga as a tradition very much alive by reference back to scripture. And I wanted to sort of pick up on a particular thread of that, I guess, for our conversation today, which is specifically Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So again, many listeners will be familiar with Patanjali, who was the great saint or sage that codified really a lot of the philosophical teachings of yoga in his scripture, the Yoga Sutras. And in the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali outlines many different things, but one of the important teachings in that scripture is the teaching of the yamas and the niyamas, which are codes of conduct, I guess you could say, like ethical codes about how we live our lives. And, we could talk for hours about all the different yamas and niyamas and what that means. But the ones I wanted to really focus on today are the first three of the yamas. And the yamas have to do with how we are out in the world. So they have less to do with our relationship to self, that's more the niyamas, and more to do with how we interact with the external world. And like our teacher Sharon Gannon would say, eventually otherness disappears. So as we are on this spiritual path, eventually we get to the point where we stop seeing separation between ourselves and others, and we see commonality. But up until that point, we need some guidelines or some ethical considerations, I guess you could say, some integrity around how we relate with otherness, how we relate with those who we perceive as being different to us. And those differences can manifest in so many different ways. It could be gender, it could be culture, it could be language, it could be the ability of your physical body, so many different manifestations of that. But I wanted to really focus in today, particularly on a conversation that's very relevant for us living in Australia, which is the relationship between colonial settlers and the Indigenous people, the First Nations people of Australia. And this conversation, although it's relevant specifically to us here in Australia, I feel like it's also relevant in a much broader context, because India was also colonized, United States of America was colonized. So many of our listeners who are coming in from all over the world will have their own relationship to Indigenous culture and colonialism. It's not a unique phenomenon to Australia. So The first one of those yamas is Ahimsa, which often gets translated as non-violence. It's kind of a very obvious connection, but do you want to share with us a little bit about what your thinking is around Ahimsa and sort of, yeah, being a First Nations person and how you feel into that and what you think about that?
Yeah, so like you said, the obvious links in this conversation with Ahimsa is the amount of violence that was used in colonization, which is not unique to Australia, but has happened throughout many years across the globe, and not just from the English, who have probably been the most recent colonizers, but also going back to the French and the Spanish and the Dutch. But yeah, so I definitely think moving to a place of Ahimsa for us here in Australia, in our relationship with Indigenous Australia, is one that is still very, that needs a lot of work, and it's still very rocky, the relationship. I do wish that a lot of people would consider these notions a little more, and who knows, maybe the hippie mind in me would like to hope that the Age of Aquarius will bring something new, but there's definitely things that still happen on a daily basis. I know deaths in custody and the legal age of children being allowed to be incarcerated, being so young. I think it was lower to 10, now it's back to 13, but I still think that's way too young to be imprisoning young children who, you know, in the Northern Territory, 90% of children incarcerated are Indigenous. So there's a lot of violence still perpetrated towards Indigenous Australians. But if like, something that I really wanted to talk about is how I personally like to embody Ahimsa into my daily practice as a First Nations person. And I think for me, that goes back to how I relate to country and how I relate to the environment. Despite the fact that I didn't grow up in my traditional country, one thing that has really been embedded in me is how I take care of country and how I take care of the environment. For myself, being somebody who lives and works in the city, and I don't need to hunt for my food, I choose to live a vegan lifestyle, and which isn't traditional, but I also don't need to hunt for survival, and that's that for me should be reserved for people who don't have a shop down the road, and who are trying to reawaken ways to traditionally connect to their country and be to place themselves back in the cycle of life and death, and how we used to operate on a daily basis for years and years and years. So that's one way I really try to bring Ahimsa into my cultural practice. I also try to plant Indigenous plants in my garden. That's been a different way I'm trying to take care of country, so that I can encourage native birds, native insects, and native bees to come back into the area. So for me, it's been the smaller things and how I embed Ahimsa into daily life. My use of plastic and trying to reduce that is very challenging, but it's definitely a process. Yeah. So there are a few things.
So it's very much like, I can see the thread of activism there, but it's also, which I love, it's very much about the small daily actions, because like you say, when we look at things like deaths in custody or incarceration of young people, these are just like overwhelming ideas to grapple with, or I mean, I just feel so much heartbreak and overwhelm when I look at the statistics or hear the stories, and then with that overwhelm often can come a sense of powerlessness, like what can I do? And if you're like me and you're from a colonial background, so, you know, if your lineage is part of the problem, I guess you could say, then there's also the whole kind of guilt and shame element too, which can be quite disabling. You can feel like I don't know what to do. And I think one of the things I've noticed a lot recently, which disturbs me actually with the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, is a lot of white people or people from colonial backgrounds not being involved in any activism work, not being involved in conversation or dialogue or education because they're scared to do it wrong or to make a mistake. And so I think, in fact, one of my intentions in creating this summit, the sort of byline for the summit is a safe space for brave conversations. And I thought about that so much because I want people to feel brave enough from every side, from every facet, from whoever you are, just from the human experience, to be in conversation and to feel like we can, no matter how small the effort that we're making, or no matter how uninformed we are right now, how little we feel we know, that our contribution is valid. Because any step in the right direction, even just the intention, even if you make a mistake, even if you say something offensive by mistake, or you know, do something that's not very sensitive, the intention for reconciliation and for learning and for healing, I feel, is very powerful. So it makes me feel comforted to hear you talk about small things, you know, that it's a good start.
Yeah, I've definitely felt the same. It can feel very overwhelming and you can feel quite disempowered. These issues are so massive, and you know, I'm a choreographer and a dancer, and I feel like, what can I do in my job? I mean, I do create work that has a message. I've just recently created a work called The Complication of Lyrebirds, which is based on the exemption form that my my great-grandparents had to sign, and this disconnect from culture and the elements of White Australia policy and how that's bled into the generations. But I do feel at times, you know, like what does that really do at the end of the day? I hope that some people may have come to see my work and know a little bit more about our history that has been hidden. But I do sometimes feel that as a choreographer, you know, what real change am I making? It is hard with these really huge issues, but I do feel like I have control over my backyard, and that might be the only place that I truly know that I can walk away and say I changed something. My father bought 10 acres in northern New South Wales to retire on, and it was an old cattle farm, and it's been his mission in retirement and getting older to plant native rainforest trees on his 10 acres. So he's pulled up all of the old fences, and he's started to grow this incredible, really young rainforest. I mean, the tragic thing about rainforest is when you cut it down, there's millions of years that are lost. So we will never see the result of his work in our lifetimes or our great grandchildren's lifetimes, but that's an example of where he has been able to take control of his own pocket of grass, and literally, and decide to make a change there. So I do always think that when we do feel overwhelmed with these huge issues and you can feel very powerless, that it's important to come back to the things that you can control, and that it can even extend into your local government area. It's sometimes even feels like that is a little bit too far, but they're really areas in our local community and the local government where our voices are more likely to be heard.
Yeah.
So being a part of the conversation in local government areas and local communities is probably going to make more of an impact than signing a some of us petition, where it feels like, yeah, your voice is going out to the wind and you just don't know if it's really doing anything.
I know that for me, a huge part of it has been education. It's been learning about, like you said before, what really happened and what is still continuing to happen, and the stuff that gets swept underneath and hidden, and that's still happening. So, the next Yama after Ahimsa is Satya, which is all about truth telling and storytelling. And actually, that's where your work as a choreographer really comes in, because through our creative, whether it's art or music or dance or even a yoga practice, through those creative pursuits, we have the opportunity to be storytellers and create some education. So, I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Satya, on truth telling more broadly, but I'm also interested to just pick up on a thread that you mentioned before, your dance about the lyrebirds, and you spoke about exemption form, and I don't know what that is. So I would love for you to teach me a little bit what happened in the history of your family.
Yeah, so the exemption form was it was an initiative by the Australian government under the White Australia policy, where an individual had the opportunity to sign this form, which was an exemption from the Act, the Aboriginal Border Protections Act, which allowed an individual to get a job, to enter into mainstream white society, to have a house in town, so to not live on the fringes in town in the blacks camps. You could send your kids to school, you could get married. There's a whole heap of privileges that were only allowed for white Australians that Aboriginal people weren't allowed to do unless they signed this form. So obviously it was a very difficult decision to make, because in return of signing this form and gaining those so-called privileges, you had to cut off all connection with your family, your traditional family. You weren't allowed to speak language, weren't allowed to take part in any cultural activity. So you basically had to live like a white person and pretend. And I like to look back on all of our ancestors who may have signed this from all over the country, and think of them as incredible survivors. And I chose the vehicle and the image of the lyrebird, who mimics the voices and the calls of other birds in order to get a mate, as a really great metaphor for our ancestors who made these really tough choices in order to survive. This is a really incredible story of survival. And a lot of shame has been associated with these forms. It obviously created a lot of division in communities, people who decided to keep culture and the people who decided to sign the forms. But I think it's time to erase that division and see all of our ancestors as really great at survival, and that this is one instance where they chose to survive.
Yeah, and it's really emotional listening to you talking about that, because it's so, you just paint a picture where it seems like such a visceral kind of choice, like really an impossible choice, And as a parent, when you were speaking just then, I was thinking about, you know, sometimes we make choices for ourselves, and that's one thing, but when you're a parent, you make choices for your children and for future generations, and that might sometimes be a choice that you think you're doing the best for them and for their future, and it might be at your own cost, at the cost of what you think is right for you or what you feel in your heart is right for you. And I love that connection that you've made with the lyrebird. It's so beautiful, such a beautiful imagery, and it makes so much sense. Yeah, it's really a really powerful piece of work.
Thank you.
Yeah, so is there anything else around this piece of the storytelling? Because I feel like that's very closely linked to the idea of satya, which is truth telling, right? Because so much of Indigenous history all over the world, but particularly here in Australia, is still not being spoken about. It's still, there's still so much hiding in the shadows. And, you know, there's a famous sort of activist saying, when you know better, you can do better. And I feel like, even in school, like I can say, for example, and this is true, like my eldest child is 14. He goes to a pretty progressive school in the inner west here in Sydney, although he's at high school now. When he first started at primary school, his kindy class 10 years ago did a presentation about first settlers. And they actually said, and there was an uproar as a result of this, but some of the children in one of the assemblies said, and the white people came with Captain Cook, and they came off the ship, and they made friends with the Aboriginal people, something like that, right? And at the time, it kind of almost slipped under the radar. A few parents were like, what the fuck, like that, can we just pause a moment here and have a conversation about that? And it was a thing, so it was discussed, and the children were told differently, like there was an educational process that happened there. But that's not that long ago. If I compare that to now, where, for example, my younger children now in the same school are learning a completely different version of history that is far more accurate, that really takes into account the nuance of shame and learning and reconciliation. They're learning the national anthem in language. Like there's a lot of different things happening that it's only a 10-year time frame, but it's a huge radical difference in how history is being taught. Do you feel like that is evolving? Like, is that, are we heading in the right direction in some way?
Yeah, I definitely think things are changing. It happens so slowly, where you just feel like things are not moving fast enough. But I do think it begins with the little ones and the small young minds who are actually turning around and telling adults how they should be reacting, speaking, thinking. It's very impressive. And I do think that things are shifting slowly. This is where I come back to coming back to your local government area. So schools work with local government and local communities to set up these programs. I know in New Zealand they've got the various language groups of Māori gathered and decided on a and I don't want to be quoted here because I'm not sure if my facts are entirely straight, but I know they agreed on a language that could be shared across the whole country so that everybody could speak a version of Te Reo Māori. But here in Australia, we have so many very different languages. So working with local community and local government is a very good way to start those conversations and to learn, because like that's kind of the premise of being an Indigenous person, being First Nations person, is your connection to your community, your connection to country. So, and even if you're not an Indigenous person, having that connection to your local community and the country on where you're living knowing what kind of plants and animals are in the area, knowing the people who are in the area, and beginning to familiarize yourself with those communities is really the best way to start. Because like we were talking before, if you try and think too broadly, it just becomes, feels too much. So I do think this is where schools are really hitting the nail on the head.
Yeah.
And hopefully things change with our young ones.
And absolutely. And as yoga teachers, just to think again in terms of those micro communities, I think we have a great opportunity, regardless of our background, to be involved in that process of education. And, you know, very simple things like, for example, at the beginning of a yoga class, sharing an acknowledgement of country, or including some of these teachings within the context of the yoga philosophy is a way of bringing a very big picture conversation into the here and now and into the sort of micro moments.
Yeah, I was definitely having a think about Satya when you were talking before about how traditionally in traditional communities who are still speaking language as their first language and not English as their first language, it made me think a lot about when you do go and visit traditional communities who are still operating a lot in those old ways. Satya is really interesting in the way Patanjali poses it as a restraint and knowing when to talk and when not to talk. And if anybody has been to a community, there's often not a lot is verbally said, a lot is unsaid, and it's all about watching and listening and talking and asking lots of questions is not really common practice. So words are very carefully chosen and not used like I do, where they're just like blah 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 blah. So that's a really interesting way of thinking of Satya for me, in relation to my culture, is how we can choose our words wisely and how listening and watching maybe is sometimes more important than just speaking first. And I think that's something that I would like to do more of within myself and my local community and my elders, is to listen more and watch and learn in that way. And I hope to pass that on to my son as well. But I think that's a really good way of approaching your local Indigenous community, is to watch and listen first before talking.
Yeah, and as you're sharing that, I'm thinking about the way that traditionally yoga was taught, which is exactly the same, right? You would have a teacher or a guru, and you might spend years in the presence of your guru, watching, learning, absorbing, without being formally taught. We're very obsessed with a quite linear educational model in our culture, and it's all around words and information rather than embodied knowledge. I mean, this is the whole internet, right? It's like there's no more need for information. It's there in your mobile phone. Anything you want to know. It's not really a currency anymore that has that much value, but what has value is embodiment. It's like knowing and absorbing and actually living. And I suffer from this myself. Like oftentimes it's sort of the shiny object syndrome. Like you sort of see a course online or you read a book and you think, oh yeah, that's really interesting. It's knowledge, but you got to do the practice.
Yeah.
You know what we're meant to be doing. It's like then applying it and doing it. And I feel like that's something our current contemporary culture's completely lost, is embodiment. And when we go back just a little bit into more Indigenous or First Nations cultures, often what we see is exactly what you said, less of the words, less of the sort of like education and more just embodied participation. It's something very powerful in that. I feel like it's very similar in the Indian yogic tradition to what you're describing.
I agree. There have been times where I've been with like in community, and those people who have been asking all the questions over and over again have been told off. And it did remind me of my training, where questions are welcome, but also it is in the doing, it is in the watching and the listening, and letting it absorb in a different way. I think we give our conscious brain too much credit, and our subconscious and our bodies not enough credit in learning.
Yeah, totally agreed. And I also agree with you that it's something I'm really keen to try to impart to my own children through what I model. And I'm not always successful at that. Like, I'll say that too. Like, it's pretty counterculture, actually. You've got to really apply yourself to that, because we're so technology kind of knowledge oriented, information oriented.
Yeah, information oriented. That's right.
Yeah. I want to start to wrap up, but the last little piece of the puzzle I wanted to talk about is asteya. Asteya is the idea of not stealing. Again, some pretty obvious connections in terms of colonialism and First Nations people, and this idea of taking that which has not been, it's more than not stealing. It's a teaching of to not take or appropriate that which has not been freely given, which is a subtle, a sort of subtle shift away from non-stealing. Because when we think about stealing, we think about literally like taking something, the material, but this goes deeper than that. It's like not appropriating, not taking as one's own. For example, plagiarizing would be a form of stealing in that context, taking someone else's work and passing it off as your own. How do you feel into that in regards to the connection with Indigenous culture and colonialism?
I think there's so many layers to this. The most obvious ones, what we were talking about before, is land stealing, and the basis on what our country is built on is that land was taken, and it's unceded sovereign country that we live on every day, and we continue to operate as a country on. So that's the very obvious one that I'm not sure how it will be rectified in the future, if ever. But exactly like you were saying with plagiarism, I think appropriation is something that you and I have spoken a lot about in the past, and that's it's something that's a bit of a hot topic at the moment, but I think it's really important to talk about for Indigenous Australians, that our culture is our own, and it's not for other people to borrow. And this also extends onto, I think, India is having an interesting consciousness at the moment about appropriation, that I know in yoga it's a really hard topic to navigate. Appropriation is like, sometimes it's not certain where you would draw the line. But in terms of my own culture, I think the really interesting thing to bring it back to is that it can be passed off as appreciation, but knowing where appreciation stops and appropriation starts can be difficult. But if at the end of the day, if you haven't had permission, then it might be appropriation. So the non-stealing is definitely, it's not just physical objects, it's intellectual property, it's cultural content, language, it's cultural practices such as painting and weaving and singing, and how we can share in those practices, even with things like land management and using Indigenous plants and coming back to Indigenous information with how to restore country. That's a really blurry line too, because we want to be able to take care of country and restore country, but how do we do it in a way that's working with community so we know we're doing it in the right way and we're planting things in the right areas, we're working with the right seasons, etc. And the only way to do that is to work with your local community and speak to elders and get permission. Yeah, so it goes very deep. Yeah, what's the last thing you mentioned?
Yeah,
Another point.
it was about, I think you addressed it first. It's this idea about in India, the sort of appropriation of the yoga teachings. And one of the conclusions I've come to, because this is something I've contemplated a lot, and I know several really incredible yoga teachers who have stopped teaching yoga now and they're calling it something else, which again, it gets so complicated, because if you're basically teaching yoga, but because you're white skinned, you've decided you can't call it yoga anymore, but it's still those teachings, and then you're not even labeling it with this original name. I have some problems with that too. So
yeah, so do I.
Is it worse to appropriate, or is it worse to just completely deny lineage altogether? It gets really mind-boggling. Where I've sat with it, like where I'm at the moment, and this could change, because I really see my relationship to this whole concept as evolving. Like, I don't know, I'm just doing the best right now in the moment with what I have. Is it's what you said, it's permission, but it's even more than permission, it's invitation. Like, if there's an invitation extended to teach and to share. For example, I'm very closely connected to the Hare Krishna movement. That's a big part of my practice, Krishna consciousness. And Srila Prabhupada came from India to the West with the express intention of sharing Krishna consciousness with Westerners. Like, it was more than a invitation, it was actually a missionary pilgrimage, you know. And so I feel like if I practice Krishna consciousness in his lineage, it's very much by invitation. It's very much, it was his vision and his mission to bring Western people into those teachings. So that's one side. It's a sort of invitation, permission thing. But I think there's another piece. Again, it gets complicated with yoga, and it gets very complicated with the Indigenous conversation, which is around monetizing. I feel that if, as someone who comes from a colonial background, you are, even by invitation, you're monetizing a system or a legacy that has in the past been perpetrated against, it can get really tricky. Like, I'll give you an example from my own life. This year, I along with Eve White, who's another person who'll be on this summit, her and I have put together a program of cultural awareness for yoga teachers. And it's a lot of work around very much the conversations that we're having right now. In fact, I might, with your permission, include this recording in that program, because I think it's really helpful. And I made the decision around that I was going to do this as a saver, as a karma yoga practice, and not earn any money from it. So it's been quite a lot of work, but I've seen it as a way that I can give back and support reconciliation. And it just, for me, it doesn't feel right for me to then monetize that personally. So that's been one decision. The yoga thing is complicated because I make my living by teaching yoga. I have done for 20 years. Like, if I decided not to monetize that, I don't know how I would make a living. But I do feel a discomfort. I do have some questions around that. And so I think there's something around that. There's something around the even and fair distribution of the money and the monetizing of, whether it's Indian culture through yoga or Indigenous culture through the cultural awareness teachings, that is certainly in my mind at the moment as a consideration.
Yeah, I think it's a really important thing to consider, because we do live in a monetary society now. We don't trade anymore. We get our livings and our survival from money. And it's definitely a conversation that I have in regards to Aboriginal cultural intellectual property, and what is the monetary value on that? And just because as a traditional society, Aboriginal people didn't operate in terms of a monetary figure, does that mean that their cultural knowledge is just traded in a good-hearted way, or in a more of like a soul trade way? And I actually don't believe that. I believe that our elders should be remunerated for their knowledge, so that they can go home and feed their families. That's their property. That's what they're trading, what they're giving. And what you were saying in the way of appropriation, I think in a similar way to working with local community and your elders, and having that really strong relationship with local elders, so you know where your line is, and you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you're not appropriating their intellectual property, that you're using it or sharing it or taking part with in relationship. I think it's very similar to how yogic students always have a teacher, and that teacher has a teacher. And so it's when somebody loses their relationship with their teacher that things kind of go awry, because there's nobody to hold you accountable. And I think accountability is a very important value in First Nations communities, as it is in yoga.
Yeah, it's this acknowledging that we're part of communities and that we have a responsibility, and accountability and a responsibility. I think that's another very important element. And I think we can leave it there. Like, we could talk for so long about this. There's so many layers, and I just feel very privileged, I really do, to be in conversation about these things, because I feel like we're all figuring this out together. We're a new emerging generation, and our children are another generation beyond. And we can say lots of negative things about history, and it can become very depressing when we look at history, but we can also say that historically human beings are incredibly resilient and also have capacity for regeneration, forgiveness, I want to say reconciliation, and I don't mean that in the sense of denying what's happened in the past, but here we are, here we find ourselves in this incredible melting pot of multicultural society and a global village that isn't going to change. The internet's not going to go away. Colonialism happened, and it's like, well, where do we all together step forward in these qualities of non-violence and truth-telling, and not taking the things that have not been freely given? And I really, really believe that education and conversation is the beginning point for that. Like, action is super important too. I'm not saying it's all about the talking and the educating, but I know for myself, like, the more I know and the more I understand, the more my actions become then aligned to my values.
That's right. And you can't act if you don't understand. So definitely, I think conversation is a really good way to unpack these things with each other.
Thank you. Thanks for being part of this today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I just also want to thank country on where I am at the moment, Darkington country, and thank the elders past, present and future for keeping me safe here. And
all of us. Thank you.
And all of us.
Jasmin.
Thanks so much, Katie.